These artifacts exhibit metallurgical sophistication that shouldn't have appeared on the human timeline for another 1,500 years. I mean, think about that. We aren't just talking about heated metal. No, we are talking about deliberate carbon ratios, specific quenching mediums, and a mastery of thermal treatment that borders on the alchemical. Why have we spent so long ignoring the chemical genius required to sustain such an empire? Perhaps, you see, it is because to admit that the Romans possessed this knowledge is to admit that history is not a steady climb, but a cycle of brilliance, followed by a profound, inexplicable forgetting. But if this metallurgical mastery was so widespread, why did the secrets behind their most resilient alloys evaporate the moment the Western Empire began to crumble? We assume the knowledge was lost in the chaos, but that ignores a far more uncomfortable possibility, right? What if the smiths of the imperial era were hiding something far more advanced than just a better way to forge a sword? Beneath the shadow of the Colosseum and the marble grandeur of the Forum, there existed a world largely invisible to the chroniclers of the age. Intense, while senators debated and emperors postured, you see the true architects of Roman hegemony were tucked away in the soot-stained corners of the Subura or the fortified fringes of the frontier. These were the Fabri, the elite military engineers and master smiths. Now, to call them mere blacksmiths is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of their craft. They were, in truth, the very first industrial chemists of the Western world. In an era long before the periodic table, the Fabri worked in the flicker of charcoal fire, mastering the volatile dance of carbonization. They possessed an intuitive understanding of molecular structure that scholars today, well, they still struggle to replicate it. By manipulating the precise timing of the quench and the delicate introduction of organic additives to the furnace, they could transform brittle iron into resilient, flexible steel that could shatter a Celtic blade upon impact. But this was not merely tradecraft passed down from father to son. No, it was state intelligence. These artisans belonged to secretive guilds, guarded by strict hierarchies and protected by the long arm of the imperial bureaucracy. For a fabricator to share his formula for tempering was not just a breach of business etiquette, right? It was an act of treason. Their workshops were designed for silence. The specific rhythmic pulse of the bellows and the precise temperatures required for complex alloying were encrypted in oral tradition, hidden in the rhythmic chants of the forge. They treated their steel as a holy relic, a substance that gave Rome the edge in every theater of war, from the damp forests of Germania to the sun-scorched deserts of Parthia.
Yet, as we examine the remnants of their work today, a strange anomaly emerges. If these guilds were so efficient and their knowledge so vital to the survival of the state, why then does the record go cold so abruptly? Why does the sophisticated metallurgical fingerprint found in first-century weaponry just vanish, replaced by inferior, cruder ironwork as the empire began to fracture? We are led to believe that the instability of the era simply caused the knowledge to slip through the cracks of history. But that is far too convenient. There is a mounting suspicion that these guildmasters didn't just forget how to forge these alloys, they intentionally buried the blueprints. And if we look closely at the inscriptions found near the sites of the largest imperial armories, we find a detail that has been systematically ignored for centuries. An obsession with a particular, rare element that should not have been present in the Roman metallurgical cycle at all. Deep beneath the silt of ancient harbor ruins, You know, divers have uncovered something that defies our very understanding of the Roman world. Imagine hauling an anchor from the Mediterranean floor, expecting the rusted, flaky ruin of 1,000 years. Instead, you find a structure that has barely yielded to the sea. It remains smooth, stubborn, and structurally sound, composed of an alloy so precise, so remarkably resistant to corrosion that it mocks the very definition of ancient craftsmanship. How did a civilization relying on charcoal-fired furnaces and bellows achieve such chemical purity? In our modern era, right, we utilize high-temperature electric arc furnaces to scrub away the impurities that plague iron. Yet, when we analyze the elemental composition of these Roman artifacts, we find a baffling absence of the slag and silicate inclusions that should be there. It is as if the metal was purged in a fire hotter than the technology of the time could possibly produce. This mystery, well, it only deepens when we turn our attention to the imperial coinage. We have found coins that possess an integrity of metal that pushes against the very limits of metallurgical theory. They are not merely minted, they are chemically engineered. If these craftsmen were indeed working with rudimentary tools, we are forced to confront a disturbing realization. Our understanding of the technological timeline is fundamentally flawed. Speculatively, perhaps the secret did not lie in the heat of the furnace, but in the additive process, a mysterious recipe of catalysts that have been scrubbed from the historical record. But if they possessed the knowledge to create such advanced alloys, why is there no trace of their specialized laboratories? Why does the archaeological trail go cold right at the threshold of their greatest discoveries? The answers seem to be hidden in the very silence of the ruins. But you see, there is one detail that has kept researchers awake for decades. These metallic marvels are often found buried alongside artifacts that serve no utilitarian purpose. Could this indicate that the secret to their metallurgy was not meant for the masses, but reserved for a select, guarded elite? And if you think the purity of these coins is unsettling, just wait until you see the microscopic evidence found on the tools used to cut them.
Under the sterile lens of a modern scanning electron microscope, the surface of a Roman gladius ceases to be mere rusted iron. It reveals a structural complexity that defies our standard timeline of human progress. You see? We are looking at a carbon gradient layer, a precise, calculated transition of hardness that stretches from the spine of the blade all the way down to the razor-sharp edge. For decades, historians dismissed these blades as fortunate anomalies, happy accidents born from a blacksmith's lack of control over his forge. But the microscopic evidence tells a far more unsettling story. This was not a product of chance. It was a masterpiece of deliberate, repeatable engineering. What we observe at the molecular level is quite frankly identical to the modern process of case hardening. Roman smiths were manipulating the iron's atomic structure, infusing the surface with carbon while keeping the core ductile and shock-absorbent. To achieve this, they needed to precisely regulate the thermal atmosphere inside their kilns, a feat that requires a deep, empirical understanding of metallurgical kinetics. They weren't just pounding metal, right? They were performing chemistry on a scale we previously assumed was impossible for a civilization powered by hand bellows and charcoal. When you study the distribution of these alloys across the Mediterranean, the implication becomes unavoidable. There was a standardized, sophisticated, and perhaps highly guarded blueprint for production.
But if they possessed the knowledge to create near-impenetrable armor and surgical-grade steel, why does the archaeological record suggest this technology vanished as quickly as it appeared? Perhaps the secret was never meant to be discovered by the masses, but hidden in plain sight within the very tools used to carve the legacy of an empire. And that brings us to an even more chilling question. What happens when the evidence of a lost industrial revolution is found not in a factory, but inside a tomb? The transition from the absolute height of Roman ingenuity to the heavy silence of the Middle Ages, well, it wasn't a sudden snapping of a cord. Solemnly, no, it was a slow, agonizing dissolution of a global network. Just imagine, for a moment, the sheer complexity of a Roman steel foundry. You see, it required specialized fuels to reach those extreme temperatures, supply chains stretching all the way from the iron mines of Britannia to the copper deposits of Cyprus. And then there were the highly trained guilds of smiths who guarded their metallurgical recipes as closely as the Vestal Virgins guarded the sacred flame itself. When the machinery of the empire began to fracture, these interconnected nodes of knowledge didn't just fade, they were severed. Gravely, as the western provinces crumbled under the weight of migration and economic volatility, the luxury of sophisticated metallurgy, it simply became an impossibility. I mean, you cannot smelt, refine, and temper at an industrial scale when your trade routes are overrun by conflict, and your currency, well, it's been debased into worthlessness. The technical manuals, inscribed on expensive parchment and kept in the rarefied air of imperial libraries, they were often the very first casualties of a society in survival mode. The vast, intricate web of Roman infrastructure was dismantled, and with it, the collective expertise of generations vanished right into the smoke of burning cities.
Now, this wasn't just a period of stagnation. It was a systemic collapse of industrial potential. Consider the sheer loss of momentum. For 1,000 years, the forge fires of Europe burned lower, the chemistry of alloys grew simpler, and the blueprints for a mechanized future, they were relegated to the realm of myth. Humanity essentially pressed reset on its own progress, trading the brilliance of Roman engineering for the harsh, localized struggle of feudal survival. We often view this era as a mysterious vacuum, but the truth, well, it's far more sobering. It was a deliberate regression, necessitated by the loss of the world's most advanced supply chain. But here is where the narrative takes a truly haunting turn. If the knowledge of these near-impossible alloys was so vital to the strength of the empire, why was it never recorded in a way that survived the chaos of the fall? Was there a deeper, more intentional effort to keep the secrets of the forge out of the hands of those who would inherit the ruins of Rome? We have only just begun to piece together the fragments left behind, but there is one final, uncomfortable discovery that suggests we may have been looking at the wrong evidence all along. We often operate under the comforting illusion that history is a steady upward climb, a singular, linear march toward the enlightenment we enjoy today. But you know, as we stand amidst the rusted remnants of Roman metallurgy, that narrative shatters. We are not the apex of a long ascent. We are merely the latest inhabitants of a world built upon the ruins of forgotten giants. The sophisticated alloys we have explored, the materials that defied their era, remind us that progress is fragile. It is a cycle of peaks and valleys, a flickering candle in a vast, dark expanse of time. When the Roman flame dimmed, it didn't just grow faint, it was extinguished, leaving behind a silence that lasted centuries. This was not a slow decay of knowledge, but a sudden fracture.
The secrets of the forge, the precise temperatures, the mineral ratios, and the alchemical intuition of the master smiths were not written down in textbooks for posterity. They were held in the calloused hands and shared wisdom of a guild culture that vanished when the infrastructure of the empire collapsed. It is a humbling lesson, right? In a matter of generations, the impossible can become a myth, and the myth can eventually be forgotten entirely. Intrigued, we look back at the gleaming steel of the past and wonder how they achieved such perfection with nothing more than charcoal, bellows, and sweat. Perhaps the true tragedy of history is not that we lost the ability to create these alloys, but that we lost the context of their creation. We assume our predecessors were primitive because they did not possess our digital precision, yet they possessed a mastery over matter that we are only just beginning to decode. They lived in a world where the line between science and sorcery was thin, and in that space they achieved wonders. History is never truly dead. It is waiting in the shadows of the earth, buried under layers of dust and time, daring us to question our own assumptions of superiority. Every scrap of metal, every weathered coin, and every buried blade is a whisper from a civilization that knew secrets we are still struggling to rediscover.
Deep, deep within the ruins of the Roman Empire lies a metal alloy so advanced, you see, modern scientists actually struggled to replicate it for decades. Imagine, if you will, the damp, iron-rich soil of a Roman outpost in northern Britain. The air is thick, thick with the scent of wet earth and the ghosts of a forgotten legion. Beneath the sediment, a team of archaeologists brushes away the debris of 2,000 years to reveal a relic that defies our understanding of history. It is a blade, buried in the dark, yet as the oxidation is gently cleared away, the steel beneath remains hauntingly, impossibly preserved. While common iron of that era should have surrendered to the slow decay of centuries, this metal gleams with a defiance that challenges the very timeline of human innovation. We look at our modern steel, forged in high-heat industrial furnaces, and we simply assume it represents the pinnacle of human achievement. We teach our children that the path of progress is a straight, upward line, that the ancients were crude, their tools primitive, and their knowledge limited, by the constraints of their time. But what if we have been looking through a distorted lens? What if the smiths of the Roman Empire held secrets to metallurgy that were not lost, but systematically ignored because they didn't fit the narrative of the primitive past? This blade is not merely a tool of war. It is a profound anomaly. Its molecular structure suggests a mastery of carbon ratios and quenching techniques that shouldn't have existed for another 1,500 years. As we trace the edge, still sharp enough to cut through the shroud of modern skepticism, we must confront a startling realization. We have long, long underestimated the genius of the ancients. The question is no longer just how they made it, but what else they were capable of achieving, right? And why their most brilliant breakthroughs were allowed to vanish into the dust of the Roman collapse. For centuries, we have been fed a tidy narrative, you see, that the Roman Empire was a grand stage of marble columns and sweeping arches, built by the brute force of enslaved hands and primitive, erratic iron. Historians have long painted a portrait of a civilization reaching for the stars, while shackled to the furnace of a blacksmith who barely understood the temper of his own blade. They tell us that the Roman forge was a simplistic affair, hot air, charcoal, and crude iron ore, a process that, should have resulted in brittle, unreliable tools. But as we stand within the shadow of the Forum, we must ask ourselves, really ask ourselves, how a society supposedly limited to such primitive metallurgy managed to engineer an empire that spanned 3 continents. How do you maintain a grip on the vast hostile frontiers of Britannia, Dacia, and the scorching sands of North Africa, with iron that, according to our modern textbooks, should have snapped under the stress of daily use? The discrepancy is jarring. We walk through the ruins of their engineering marvels, seeing the precision of their aqueducts and the structural integrity of their fortresses. Yet we are asked to believe that these builders were fundamentally incapable of advanced chemical control. It is an academic convenience, a way to fit the Roman timeline into a tidy, linear progression of human technological evolution. Excitedly, though, the physical evidence, the recovered gladius blades, the intricate surgical instruments, the complex locking mechanisms, tells a story that simply refuses to align with the textbooks.
If this journey into the lost echoes of the ancient world has stirred your curiosity, there is so much more to uncover. We are only scratching the surface of what the past has hidden from our sight. If you wish to continue this investigation into the brilliant, often baffling technologies of those who came before us, hit that subscribe button and join us as we piece together the fragments of the hidden epoch. Tell us in the comments, do you believe we have truly surpassed the ancients, or are we merely rediscovering the shadows of their brilliance? The investigation continues, and we want you there for every discovery.